There is no lower self. Is that a bold statement, or an ignorant statement, or is there really an actual lower self? This is something I've been thinking about for quite a while now. And my conclusion is that there is no lower self. There is no such thing as a lower state of being. And often people speak of vibrational rates as if you're raising your vibration to a different level. I'm not going to dispute that or get into the details of what that means. But let's take a red and violet, or let's take red and blue. Red is a lower vibration, it's a lower wavelength, but it doesn't make it any less beautiful than blue. We could go into the actual atomic structure, and all the detailed scientific reasons, where solid matter vibrates at the lowest frequency. The more solid something is, the lower activity there is going on in it, such as very dense metals. The electrons are bound very strongly, whereas things like water, air, are liquid and flow. And it takes both the solid and the liquid in order to make the world. It's if that makes sense. But the idea that there's this lower self that we're trying to conquer is something that I'm trying to personally, I already have personally dispelled that myth. And what it comes down to, I think, is that we live in a very, very uncomfortable life at times. And I can only speak for myself and my personal experience in my life. But so for me to make a statement like everyone has to deal with hardships in life, or everyone has to suffer, everyone has discomfort, that's a statement that I can't prove. Because there are plenty of people out there who say that everything's great and dandy, that their lives are perfect, that everything. I have heard very few people say this, but it's a disassociation with the reality that we're facing, the reality that we are human and we are three-dimensional creatures. And I guess what it is that I've heard a lot of folks speak about how we're trying to ascend back to a certain level, or that there's an end game to this universal system, that humans have evolved to this point so we can finally take the next leap forward and move into a spiritual realm, or a utopia, if you will. It's a great notion, but it really has no ground in reality, in my opinion. Here's the way I see it, is that the universe is learning, okay? The universe is learning through its own experience, whether that be through just the existence of matter, or the existence of forces and energy, or whether or not mankind really has any major part in this remains to be seen. Of the billions of galaxies and the billions of stars in those galaxies, the mathematics show that there are perhaps trillions of worlds with intelligent life. And as the Earth is only our solar system, I believe, is 4.6 billion years old, and that the rest of the universe is something like 13.5 billion years old, or 14. We are the new kids on the block. We really are the youngsters. And to think that we are the pinnacle of this evolution is silly and arrogant. But it's hard for people to think that there may be more advanced cultures out there. So, without getting too far into aliens and whatnot, we have a very anthropomorphic view of what we think that the universe wants. In other words, we say, okay, the universe wants us to ascend to this certain way of being, or the universe wants us to love, God wants us to care. But all of this is based on human experience. It's like Flatland. There's a book written called Flatland, and it's about a square who lives in a two-dimensional reality, and one day a sphere comes through this reality and passes through the two-dimensional plane, and the square is just blown away. And Nobody else believes him that there's this other dimension, this third dimension. So the sphere takes the square, takes him up into the air, and allows him to see his world from above, a dimension he's never seen before. He's amazed. He had no idea that there was so much going on. He can see everything in the land. Then he comes back down and sets the square back down. The square says, then what it is I believe the square says, well, what about a fourth dimensional reality? And the sphere just scoffs and says, that's impossible, and leaves. And that is really the metaphor for the way that we see the world. We have this three-dimensional reality. We believe that there are these other dimensions, but in order to understand, you have to be able to leave your plane. And I think what it is it's a yearning for something different, to understand how these things go together. But it's a human desire. It's not a universal desire. So when we speak about these fourth, fifth, sixth dimensions, honestly, I really don't know what people are talking about most of the time. And I don't think they do either. I know a lot of people seem to have these ideas that things are a certain way and that we just haven't quite got there yet. But I think to grasp, when I hear people talk about the fourth dimension, often they say that it's this plane of existence where maybe the spirit's realm. And then other people will say, oh, that's the fifth dimension because the fourth dimension is time. How can time be a dimension? Well, it is. What other things are dimensions? In other words, you can't comprehend, like when we have a cube and then you have the hypercube, and trying to understand how all these different things correlate to life is just frustrating. So people start making answers and they write books about it. They talk about spirituality and what it means to be human, where we're supposed to be going. And then they talk about the lower self. Is it too far of a jump to say that maybe the lower self is the spiritual essence before it became, before it manifested as flesh and blood creatures? In other words, the way I see it is that this may be the be-all, end-all, the pinnacle. Living in eternity and happiness doesn't make sense to me. But I'm sure it's, many people believe in heaven. Many people believe that when you die, you go to heaven, you see your loved ones, and you spend eternity in this great, whatever each individual views it as. But how would that be an end result? In other words, if the default mode is to find your essence and to become your essence, then why would that essence ever have become flesh and blood? Because living a life and living in emotion, with emotions, and experiencing and taking things for what they are, is an amazing experience. It's hard sometimes. Life is very difficult, but how we view that difficulty determines how we're going to feel about the situations we encounter. If you look at every challenge as an obstacle, then you might suffer because of it. If you look at every challenge as a potential, then you can change the way you perceive things. Now this comes into the positivity. People use positivity and positive thinking and love as a crutch, as a way to say, I'm going to disassociate myself completely from my own emotions, the way I truly feel, and pretend like I'm always happy. Now, I'm guilty of that. A couple of years back, I went through a phase of wanting to say, okay, I'm just going to make everything positive. And I'm not going to give anybody any of my energy. I'm not going to argue with people. And I've still kept that, but I've learned that there's a certain level where you have to be honest with yourself and honest with your emotions. If someone makes you mad, that's okay. If something makes you cry, of course that's okay. People know, nobody's going to say, oh, you shouldn't cry because of that. But there's plenty of people telling you, don't get mad about this. How are sadness and anger any different from one another? They are sides of the same, well, not coin, but maybe a cube. All the different emotions that come together to make us human, what we are. I'm just as full of shit as the next guy. You know, the ideas that I have that I express here are my own, and they're done through my own research, but more than research, experience, because I think that we have overthought way too much what it means to be a human. We are thinking way too deeply about the details and not observing the basics. In other words, we go through all these math equations and science experiments to make a discovery, when in reality just observation is often the best key. Looking at nature and the way it handles itself. For example, we're trying to figure out how to integrate into a society so where we can all get along and function. So observe a forest, how the trees function with one another. The older trees feed the young ones through the root systems and the mycelial network. Of course, this is more recent science, and back in the day we just thought that trees competed with each other, that everything was out to get one another. It was a big fight, a big battle. And we found out that that's not the case. The trees don't just feed their own young, they feed the whole system, because the whole system is needed. Now, obviously the tree is going to shadow like a bush, so it won't get as much light. Doesn't mean though that it's trying to compete with it. And it may very well share its nutrients with that, because perhaps it needs something from that plant. Some sort of amino acid or whatever. Pumped back through the mycelial network to the tree. We don't know how all these things work. We're learning. But the point being that by observing nature, we can determine how we really should act as humans. And I think that's a very valid approach. So in the forest, there is a lot of chaos. There are invasive plants. There are evasive plants probably too. But there are so many different situations going on where there are competitive areas, and then there are very content, long-lived areas. Each one of these has its own part, its own piece to play in the puzzle. And that's how humans are. Where some of us are angry at certain times. Some of us are pushy. Maybe some of us take over certain things, such as big business, pushing small business out. And I think that the same thing's happening with our mental state. Big thinking is pushing small thinking out. We need to stick to the paradigm, the scientific paradigm, yada, yada, yada. And the most important thing, I think, is to face one's own emotions and to realize and to be honest with yourself. Because then you become whole. You become whole and you learn to love yourself. Now I look at myself critically every day and think, God, I could have done this, or I could have done that, or why did I do this, or why did I do that, but not in a negative way. I use it as a building block to say, okay, the next day I'm going to try something different or try harder. But all the way, I accept what it is. I accept my position. There's a certain degree of acceptance. You have to accept where you are in life, but you have to take a certain amount of initiative to make things happen. That's one of my hardest parts, is taking initiative to things that perhaps I need to do. So I love myself, I do, and it helps me to love others, but I don't deny myself the emotion. If someone is trying to feed off of my energy, I won't allow it. But making peace with discomfort is a very important key. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And the best way that I can see to do that is to realize that it will always get better. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. But usually when you're at your lowest point, all you can do is go up. So to finish off, I guess what I would say is that, we talk about life paths. We talk about paths to get to a certain, whatever it may be. There never seems to be a real. When people speak of life paths, this is my path, or this is what I'm here to do. Exactly what does that mean? Well, that's an individual opinion. I mean, maybe it's for the whole of society. Maybe it's his path for the individual or for the family. Or maybe it's his path for God. Whatever the person believes. But we don't have paths. We have labyrinths and mazes. Yeah. Take care, everybody.